Welcome to the print. It's such a pleasure to have William Dalrymple here joining us today to talk about one of the great phenomena of Indian history, which is the expansion and growth of Indian ideas across most of Eurasia, and a process of incredible grandeur, impeccably documented by William through century after century, culture after culture. You take us well from the courts of Rome with their disapproving senators to the incredible opulence, surprisingly, of the great monastery of Nalanda, through its destruction, through the spread of Indian ideas over the seas to Southeast Asia, into the politics of the Chinese court. It's such an incredible journey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I should say we should come clean at this point and say that Anirudh was very kind to read an early draft of this book and saved me from many pitfalls and errors, for which I'm enormously grateful. And he also gave some very interesting ideas, which I followed up on how to improve it all. So Anirudh should take a bow if there's any value in this book himself.
The honor was mine, Will. Here, of course, is this magnificent book for all of you who have not already read it. I thoroughly recommend you.
Hold our copies up for the
okay. Well,
online book launch.
I have to say, Will, 2 years ago, when you so kindly hosted me on the Print channel to talk about my book, I never thought that one day I'd end up on the same channel talking to you about yours. So once again, thank you for everything. With all that said, let's actually just get straight into it. Considering the sheer scope of the idea that we are grappling with in this book, I'd like to ask you what might seem like a very fundamental question, but how did the idea come to you to write this, and how did you go about gathering, and not just gathering, but I think the more important question is distilling this enormous ocean of information into something approaching a coherent narrative history of Indian ideas?
Well, I think one day someone is going to write a PhD on lockdown books, and I think there's been a great number of outsized books published in the last couple of years by people that were stuck in their homes with their libraries over lockdown, unable to do anything but amass enormous piles of notes and write outsized books, and this definitely belongs in that bracket. I had just come to the end of a project which had taken me 20 years, which is this 4-volume history of the East India Company and how it replaced the Mughals as the most powerful force in India. And I started that project in 1999, finished it in 2019. It took exactly 20 years, 4 books. And my family were very much, I think, bored of hearing me talking about Mughals and the East India Company over the course of that time. And some of my children, who will remain nameless, even went as far as suggesting I'd written the same book 4 times, and that it was time for me to tread in on new roads and swim in new waters. And so it was during the course of lockdown, sitting reading about the area which had first thrilled me when I came to India as a teenager. When I first arrived at the age of 18, I backpacked around like lots of other kids my age, and particularly focused on places like Sanchi, which I first saw in February 1984. Mrs. Gandhi was still Prime Minister, and on down to Ellora and Ajanta and so on, and many of the great medieval temples of Tamil Nadu. I'd always wanted to be an archaeologist when I was growing up. I spent my summer holidays on archaeological digs, and it was this early period of history which fascinated me. And I think my teenage self would be very surprised and possibly disappointed that the adult turned out to be a historian of the 18th century rather than of the ancient world. And it was very nice, having completed this long project on colonial history, to go to this area which I'd always loved and been fascinated by, but which, to be honest, I was no expert in at all. I loved the Ajanta caves. I loved the monuments of early India, but had never really worked up my knowledge into any kind of specialism. And the path to this book started actually, the prehistory of it was just when I'd started writing The Anarchy. And I went on a holiday down to Aurangabad and visited the Ajanta caves for the first time in a long period. And in Cave 10, I noticed on the side walls murals that I'd never seen, and I knew Ajanta pretty well. I'd got Benoit Bell's books on it and many Amin Okada's books, and I knew the main murals very well. And I was surprised to see in Cave 10 a whole series of images I simply had never seen before. I couldn't work out how these amazing images hadn't been photographed or didn't seem to be at all familiar. So I photographed them and made some inquiries. It turned out that what was there in Cave 10 were, in fact, the oldest Buddhist murals in the world, dating from 150 BC. And they had always been there, but in the 19th century, the Nizam of Hyderabad brought in some Italian restorers who cleaned the murals and then covered them with shellac, a kind of varnish that was very sticky. And within about 10 years, batshit clung to the shellac and completely obscured these murals. It was just black. So in all the times that they were photographed, these murals had been left out. And just before my visit, an extraordinary conservation program had been undertaken by somebody called Manager Singh from the ASI office in Aurangabad, who had painstakingly taken off the varnish and the batshit and revealed these early Buddhist murals. And I took 3 months off and wrote them up. I realized this is a very important find, that anywhere else in the world, this would have been headline news. The oldest Buddhist murals in the world, the oldest murals in the world in India after Bhimbedka. If you count the sort of pictograms of Bhimbedka, they precede it. But this is the beginnings, really, of classical Indian art, and was hugely important. So I took 3 months off, wrote a long piece for Marg, the art history magazine, and then other pieces for the New York Review of Books and the Guardian, talking about this discovery and Manager Singh's work in conserving them and bringing them back. And that was the point I remember thinking, this is something I've got to come back to. And so as soon as Anarchy was finished, I started reading around this world, the early Buddhist world of India. Fairly aimlessly. I didn't quite know where it was going to end, but I just educated myself and had a lovely time during the months of lockdown with working through all the stuff in my library on that period. And by the time that lockdown was over, I had a pretty clear idea of this book in more or less the form it's actually been written. I remember right the morning that the idea came together with these 3 sections. The first section on the diffusion of Buddhism from India, the second on the diffusion of Hinduism and Sanskrit into Southeast Asia, and thirdly, the diffusion of Indian mathematics, first to the Arab world, and then to the west via Fibonacci. And I had that plan by the end of the first lockdown in whatever it was. We finally got out, I think, in July 2020. And that's the book I went and wrote. As soon as lockdown was over, I traveled all around Southeast Asia, revisited Sri Lanka, revisited all the sites from this period in India. It was incidentally while I was in Angkor Wat that a PDF of your first book, Anirudh, was sent to me, and I missed a whole day in Angkor Wat. I blame you for this because I enjoyed it so much that I stayed in my hotel room and just read all day rather than exploring. So there are still 2 or 3 major monuments in Siem Reap I haven't seen, for which I blame you. But at least it means I can go back again and see them now. Another thing that I think I'm very grateful for, that was an accident, was that I finished the book a year ago in May 2023. And I thought that book was pretty finished. I handed it into my publisher. And through a series of accidents, my editor had retired, a new editor had come in. No one had sort of clocked that the manuscript was going to arrive, and it hadn't been put in the system. And in the end, they decided to just wait an entire year. The autumn is the best time to launch a book, and they decided to launch it autumn 2024. So I had a whole extra year beyond that which was planned to edit it, rewrite it, reshape it. And I am so grateful for that year, because there's so much that I got wrong that I was able to correct, so many errors which I was able to catch, and also just enhance the main argument of the book, which was the main storyline was not nearly as clear as it is now. And the Golden Road was sort of oddly absent for a book called The Golden Road. So anyway, it's an incredible stroke of luck that I had that extra year. And I think the book is much, much, much stronger now than when you first read it, certainly.
I think that what really struck me about this history of ancient India in comparison to others is the emphasis on archaeology, which I now realize was quite an early calling, if you will. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about what archaeology is revealing to us about India's contact with the world, in classical antiquity especially, because some of the Kushan treasures that you wrote about are just astonishing, like these treasure troves of ivories or of painted Roman glass, and especially what's being discovered on the other shore of the Indian Ocean in the Red Sea. So could you tell us a little bit about these discoveries? Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of actually being up close and personal with some of these artifacts, and what it's like to actually look at them in comparison, and what kind of stories emerge as you do that?
So this is an area where a great deal of work is happening, and this book really would not have been possible to have written even 10 years ago. So much new material has emerged out of archaeological digs in every part of the story. And to give you some early examples, an excavation in Sri Lanka has revealed in the last few years the monastery of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka, which is one of the very earliest Buddhist sites in the world, which has the stupa, it turns out, of Mahinda, the son of Ashoka, with the Brahmi inscription with his name on one of the earliest, in a sense, crudest stupas. It's just a kind of tiered ranks of stone raised into a pretty basic heap, unlike the beautiful stupas of later that we associate with the smooth bell-shaped flanks. This is very, very early. But the most important work, I think, has been done by two teams of archaeologists. One, PJ Cherian and his team in Muziris, and a guy called Steve Sidebottom from Chicago, digging in Berenike, the main port of arrival for Roman sailors who were making for, the main port of arrival for Indian sailors making for the Roman world. And these two sites, Muziris and Berenike, are mirror sites. They have the same ships were passing between the two ports, and the archaeologists have sat in each other's trenches and compared notes, about finding very similar finds in both sites, either side of the Indian Ocean. And this, along with another new discovery, which is a textual discovery, a single text called the Muziris Papyrus, has turned up recently, which the Muziris Papyrus tells the story of one particular cargo that traveled from Muziris to Berenike in the 1st century. And it has the details of one container on a ship called the Hemapelon. And in that ship was 2 tons of ivory was the main contents, but there was also pepper, cotton, silk, malabathrum, which is something used in perfume making, nard, another Indian product used in Roman perfumery. And the values are given for each of these objects. So we know that if this container made it to Egypt, so high is the cost for these objects that the importer would be able to buy one of the most expensive estates in Egypt or central Tuscany and have enough spare change to join the Senate. So you could become the sort of Elon Musk of Roman Egypt just by getting one very large container full of ivory and pepper from one place to the other. And there's now calculations which are contested and in discussion among scholars, but they're now saying that between maybe a fifth and a third of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs take of 1/3 of the value of these containers at Berenike. And, the Hadrian's Wall, the Rhine frontier, the forts in Algeria, the Roman road networks, all this was heavily supported by Indian imports.
It's incredible to think of the stories of the people who were on these ships. For me personally, I think some of the most exciting discoveries from Berenike have been some of the earliest known Tamil names, as well as I think this extraordinary set of graffiti in Socotra.
Socotra is a slightly different site. Now, just to do Berenike first. Berenike's got, yes, you're quite right, these amazing pottery shards with Tamil names on them. You've got a set of early proto-Hindu gods from the Vaishnav pantheon, and an early Buddha's head that looks sort of part Palmyran, part Gandharan, but is in white marble with solar rays coming out from behind it. Beautiful thing. And then, as you say, on the way to the Red Sea, there's another site which has been discovered and studied within the last 10 years, which is a cave on the island of Socotra, which was a refueling and watering stop that ships passing up the Red Sea would stop there to gather water and to get supplies. And a lot of them seem to have gone into this cave and just carved their names on it. And so you have particularly Gujarati names, hundreds of early Gujarati names of these Gujus have just turned up and are kind of graffitiing the cave. And they're of a variety of different religions. Some are Buddhists, some are Syrian Christians, some are, a lot of them are Hindu. All this has appeared in the last 10 years.
I'm wondering, Will, if we can also address the converse flow of folks coming from the shores of the Red Sea, from the Roman Empire towards India, because I think one of a large chunk of one of the chapters is dedicated to these Yavana donors to various Buddhist sites in the Western Ghats. And if you think about it, it's just such a crazy demographic process. So who were these Yavanas? Where were they coming from? And then why were they making gifts to Buddhist monasteries of all things?
So there is some dispute about this, and I mean the initial thought was that the Yavanas, that the word Yavana is the same as the English word Ionian, and that these are basically Greeks. Whether those Greeks meant Greeks from Bactria in what's now Afghanistan, or Greeks from Greek-speaking Egypt, but it's not entirely clear, and clearly the word had quite wide usage, and maybe some Sogdians and Parthians were also described as Yavanas. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these guys were Greeks, but some of them clearly were. We have not only do we have these pillars and sculptures and capitals dedicated by these Greek sailors to temples in the Western Ghats. We also have a whole range of other religious inputs coming into Southwest India. So obviously the whole legend of St. Thomas Christians and the first Jews in Kerala date from this time. Now, we don't know whether St. Thomas actually came. The early Acts of Thomas maintains he does. Other traditions say Barnabas turned up. But we do have records in impeccable church sources from first century Alexandria saying Indian delegations turned up asking for bishops and texts and holy objects to carry on practicing their religion. So we know that there was Christianity of some sort brought by somebody. And it makes perfect sense. If there's Hindu gods and images of the Buddha turning up in Berenike on the Red Sea, there's absolutely no reason why a Christian priest or a Christian monk or an early Christian missionary, along with Jewish traders and Jewish holy men, could not also turn up on the coast of Kerala. So I think we can now see a great deal more contact between the two. There's also been a lot of work in art history, and something that interests me very much is that we've always imagined that all those magnificent Gandharan statues that you see in so many great Indian collections, whether in Mathura or Delhi or Calcutta, or best of all Chandigarh, that these were influenced by early Hellenistic influences. In other words, the lost legions of Alexander left in the Hindu Kush. And that was all very sort of Kipling, with the man who would be king, and Sean Connery and Michael Caine discovering these lost Greeks in Afghanistan, all that kind of thing. In reality, it turns out that this is nothing to do with the Bactrian Greeks at all. It's the influence of Roman trade into Kushan areas in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, particularly the Peshawar Valley, but also the Kabul Valley and Swat. And that the images which are being copied or adapted in those areas, giving the prototypes of the Buddha, are in fact Roman statues, not Greek ones, dating from, this makes much more sense for the chronology, because the Bactrian Greeks disappear about 150 BC, and the first images of the Buddha as an iconic human being, as opposed to a pair of feet or a turban or an empty throne, date from the 1st century AD, and the great Gandharan images in schist, those tall, handsome, rather hunky bodhisattvas who look as if they've been visiting the gym while they're waiting for enlightenment. These all date from the kind of 3rd and 4th century AD.
Visiting the gym and putting on a toga afterwards.
Exactly. My classical scholar friends say that what they're wearing is not actually a toga, but something called a hemation, which I'd never heard before, which is the Greek equivalent. Don't ask me to tell the difference between the two. But
So this actually brings me quite neatly to my next question. I think one of the most fascinating aspects to me of this early contact between the Mediterranean world and the Indian world is the appearance in Kushan coinage of these, for lack of a better word, these syncretic deities that are ostensibly Hindu or Zoroastrian, but then bear the iconographic attributes of Hellenistic deities. And you also seem to see this with the Kushan rulers themselves, with names like Devaputra, which is akin to the Roman Divi Filius, and sometimes they even straight up call themselves Caesar or Kaisera. So why was it that the Kushans
put on images of specifically, and this is very telling, specifically Roman Egyptian gods, since we know this trade is coming out of Rome, like Serapis, who's the god of Alexandria.
So why was it so important for the Kushans to present themselves in this particular way? Well, because you dedicate quite a lot of time in the Golden Road to talking about the Kushans. So who are these people? Why was it important for them to present themselves in this way? And what role did they play in the broader diffusion of Indian ideas into Central Asia and beyond?
So the Kushans are always slightly orphaned in Indian popular culture. They barely appear in narratives the way that the Guptas appear. The Guptas, are everywhere in our popular culture. But the Kushans are very much present in the museums. You go to the Great Museum in Mathura or the National Museum in Delhi. There are these wonderful Kushan yakshis and yakshas and stupa railings and so on. And the Kushans are interesting because they are a Indo-European people who got driven by the Huns down into what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan. And while they're conquering their way south to Delhi and Mathura, ironically, the effect is to open up the passes which have been closed and the trade routes which have been difficult to go through. And by uniting what's now Xinjiang, in Western China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India, and with that to have ultimately their capital in the south in Mathura, just near Delhi, they open a way northwards. They open the passes, so Buddhist monks start shooting in reverse direction as the Kushans are coming south. You see all these Buddhist monks going north, and you have Indian deities. And Buddhist ideas from India crossing into Central Asia during that period. So I think they're very important. I also think their art is very attractive. I know that you have a theory with my son Sam that the Kushans are the unspoken backdrop to a lot of the action in the Mahabharata, that the geography of the Mahabharata is the geography of the Kushan world, ranging from Gandhara, where Gandhari comes from, down to the plain of the Doab, really. Anyway, that's a different subject for another day, but I think it's an interesting idea.
I think that it's also, they also had this profound influence on language. Now, the earliest known great texts of Sanskrit court culture actually come from the Kushan court. We know that the Kushans were very interested in building temples and in establishing this equivalence between the king and the god, all of which would then later be picked up by the Guptas and, of course, developed in a very different way, and with a generous dose, of course, of Puranic mythology and Hinduism. But I think the ideas you can already see in the Kushan Empire. But as you said, well, that's a very interesting discussion for another day.
For another day.
What I'd like to understand is, so you mentioned a little earlier as we were talking about these yavanas who are on the West Coast. We were talking about the Sogdians, Parthians, all these Central Asian peoples, oddly enough, seem to play such a big role in the story of the diffusion of Indian ideas beyond just Indians themselves.
And they're so marginal in the Indian consciousness today. I mean, very few people have any idea who the Sakas or the Indo-Parthians or any of these things are. And yet they, as you say, they're crucial in the role of diffusing Indian culture out into Central Asia.
So what was the appeal of Indian culture to them? What was the appeal of Indian religion? What was it about Buddhism? I mean, sending monks out is one thing, but actually getting people to follow the religion is something else, something else entirely. So why was this happen?
I think there's many things which is appealing about the different kinds of Indian religion. The sheer simplicity of the Buddhist idea of an end to suffering is something that's, very appealing still today, which is why there's so many Buddhists in California at this moment, But it also was something that was clearly associated with specific communities. So you find Buddhism, which we all think of as a religion that embraces poverty. Ironically, Buddhism is promoted very early on by the merchant classes. And from the inscriptional evidence, we know that it's largely Buddhist merchants who are putting up the money for stupa railings or gates or new viharas in the middle of the Hindu Kush or whatever it is. What you find, I think, is that there's far more popularity of Hinduism among the ruling classes. The Rajputs always liked a religion that allowed them to show off their swordplay and warrior tendencies, and were rather frustrated by the non-violent aspect of Buddhism, I think. So you find there's a great deal always of fondness and interest in the ideas of Hindu kingship among the ruling classes. So you have different aspects of Indian religious ideas and different philosophies appealing to different classes in society.
So what really strikes me is that what seems to be happening around the turn of the first millennium is that you have an extremely sophisticated and diverse society in India with a number of different religions offering different things to different people. And through imperial expansion, through expanding global trade networks, this is essentially put into contact with equally diverse, equally proud civilizations who all seem to have something to offer to South Asia, and vice versa. And so you begin to see, and I think Indian religions just generally have always distinguished themselves with the sheer depth of their philosophies. The effort that thinkers seem to put into writing these dense scriptures, using these fantastical twists and turns of language, which of course you've talked about at great extent. But this of course brings me to the people who are actually doing the religious innovations, the folks who are sitting in the monasteries. The image of a monastery, of course, conjures up to us today an image of poverty and renunciation. But your description of Nalanda is of a place that's exactly the opposite.
It sounds rather like the kind of, some very fancy Taj resort somewhere in the Maldives or something, with sort of 9 towers, 9 stories high, fountains, and sort of glittering gold everywhere. Exactly. I think these places lost their ascetic aspects very quickly and became rather grand places. You find, for example, in inscriptions references to monks having slaves and laborers attached to them. So I think we sort of give up our ideas of these places as poor, and have to remember that for much of this period they were centers of enormous wealth with fantastic gold treasures littering their halls and arcades. The descriptions at the time are fantastic.
I always find it a little ironic that Chinese Buddhist monks seem to have been under this impression that Indian monks lived this life of perfect discipline, and they're traveling these thousands and thousands of miles to copy Vinaya texts, discipline texts from Indian monasteries, and they end up in essentially these ostentatious palaces with monks owning slaves and sleeping on bejeweled
and copper mines and all sorts of things like that. Exactly, and another very important factor is the role these monks played as moneylenders. Yes. We have records very early on of them sponsoring trading voyages. And we also have this image of a lot of these early Buddhist monasteries are on the coast. Places like the Canary Caves, now in the suburb of Bombay, were on an island on the coast, and the stupas there at the top of the hill would have been visible for miles out. So you can see these sailors taking their loans, going off trading with, say, Persia or Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, coming back, steering in by the stupa and repaying their loans.
I come from a place called Vishakhapatnam on the east coast.
Today, of course, and we have a very nice piece of Vishakhapatnam chest in this house, dating from the 18th century. Those nice colonial Vizag chests.
I hope I get to see it some days, because Vishakhapatnam also had... I will send you
a photograph.
Please do. So Vishakhapatnam has a hill also with a Buddhist monastery overlooking the bay, which I used to... I never climbed up as a child, of course, but I remember when I was very young, my grandfather pointing it out to me and saying there's a Buddhist monastery up there. And growing up and finding out that hordes of Roman coins have been discovered, which would heavily suggests that merchants who were crossing the Indian Ocean were returning there and then making gifts to the monastery. It's a dynamic that I think, has shaped more Indian lives than many of us often would know.
There's also a suspicious number of wine amphora found in the vicinity of some monasteries in your part of the world, in Amaravati, on the port there. They've come across something like sort of 20,000 wine amphora imported from Italy. So your taste for a tipple is deep in your genes.
Yes, it's a long-standing tradition. I also found it very interesting that in the Baranaki excavations, one of the earliest known Tamil names is of a chieftain called Koran, who was importing amphora. He was importing amphoras of wine in return for pepper. So
in actual fact, there's so much material about Indians loving Italian wine. There are some number of extraordinary things. First of all, there's a papyrus in Oxyrhynchus about a Greek play of Euripides, which is the plot is rewritten when the action is moved to India in one version found in Egypt, whereby the princess is rescued when the hero gets all the Indians drunk with an amphora of wine and rescues the girl from captivity.
Wait, how many Indians
and all the
got drunk
Indians
off
are
of
made
one
to speak. There's actually some real Kannada language in this Greek play, which is extraordinary.
Absolutely incredible. Now I think about it, like alcohol plays such a big role in some of the great Sanskrit plays of South India as well, like the Mattavilasa Prahasana, literally the farce of the drunkards games, which of course you talk about well.
I think we need to. I think we need to write an essay together on this, Anirudh. Definitely.
I would love to.
The importance of drunken South Indians in Indian literature.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted to write that. But we've strayed a little further from the topic, so let's just come back
way
to
off.
monasteries.
As is so often our way.
As it is. So, coming back to to drunken monks, these guys are sitting and writing these not just exhaustive texts about discipline, which they very clearly weren't following and intended for Chinese monks, not for themselves. But they're also doing these extraordinary ritual texts. By the 8th or 9th century, as you write, that they're figuring out the concepts of Tantra. And you begin to see in Cambodia, for example, in Angkor, which is where our story began, Will, they are using rituals that seem to have been developed by lineages of Indian priests and monks and scholars to essentially found new imperial religions, new kinds of states. So I'd like to ask you,
who I write a lot about in the book, this character Vajrabodhi,
yes,
whom uniquely a very detailed life survives, and so we're able to reconstruct his past. And he seems to be a member of the Pallava dynasty, a junior Pallava nobleman or prince who went to Nalanda, received tantric secrets in an iron stupa in South India. I'd like to know where this iron stupa is. We've got to be able to find it. He then gets sent off as an envoy to China, and on the way seems to found Borobudur, the greatest Buddhist monument in the world. So he's a fantastic character. I mean, the challenge with this book was, in a sense, finding enough human history to write, to wind narratives and biography around, so that it wasn't all about Kushan coins and fragments of pottery with the name Koran on it, which can be pretty dry for a general reader, as you know. And it was far more of a struggle in this book than I've had with my 18th century material, because the 18th century is full of gossipy diaries and lots of boys writing about their sexual exploits and all this sort of stuff. And there's very little of this. And you're lucky if you get a Buddhist monk with a bit of biography attached to him, never mind some sort of East India Company playboy. It was much more of a struggle to write a readable narrative, and one of the reasons I'm grateful for that extra year of trimming was that I had to just gently sand down a lot of the more dense archaeological and art historical material to make it palatable, as I think a lot of people obviously don't find archaeological reports that thrilling to read. So you have to find a way of making them easier to appreciate.
Well, they don't know what they're missing out on. And I say this is a fan of archaeological reports myself. But I think what you're saying about the importance of believable people in a dense nonfiction work is crucial. Well, and I wonder how you actually dealt with this challenge as somebody who writes about the early medieval period myself. How do you look at a hagiography that is produced by the disciples of Vajrabodhi, who want to make him seem like this extraordinary supernatural master, and bring out a human being through all of that? How do you go about doing that?
I think it's quite easy when you read one of those texts to sort of work out where credibility ends and where hagiography begins. So you have a story, for example, of Vajrabodhi climbing Adam's Peak, and you can visualize him doing this very easy, despite the hagiographical mist thrown around it by the fact that he, through his invocations, he manages to empty the mountain of blood-sucking yakshas and so on. But once he gets to China and starts producing rain dragons that sort of plunge through the roof of the house, where the elaboration has really got, or sending off armies of magic rats to chew the bowstrings of an invading army. That's a wonderful story, but I don't think any reader is going to confuse it for fact.
There was this particularly interesting moment in the life of Vajrabodhi where, as he's on his way to China, and first of all, how would somebody like Vajrabodhi have found out about opportunities in China? Secondly, what's really striking to me is that as he's on his way, everybody seems to be asking him to stay. And I think, as you pointed out, it really indicates that there's this hunger for Indian ideas. And these are not the ideas of the the Buddhist world necessarily. It's not the ideas of the classical Buddhist world, of this easy to understand religion that has something to offer everyone. It's a very different kind of Buddhism.
They're after magic.
It's Sanskrit speaking.
They want dragons and magic victories, and I mean, he's like Merlin. He's like sort of King Arthur's magician, and the same sort of period. No, I love a bit of that sort of stuff, and I think the art, as you say, when you're writing it, is to mix those sort of wonderful human stories with or without the hagiography, with the dense archaeological reports and so on. And that's, I mean, it's a challenge you're well used to, and know, I'm sure, well from your recent Chola book, Anirudh.
I have to say, I really liked your characterization of Rajendra. He's as a Rajendra Chola, as a guy that Sri Vijaya didn't know who they were messing with when they decided to pull their shenanigans with China. But once again, as we tend to do, Will, we have pulled away from the topic at hand. So let's come back. Let's come back to your grander narrative structure. I did not have the honor of being able to read your chapters on the Burma Kids early, and so I'd really like to talk to you about them in a little more detail. Because they play such a central role.
I think if there's anything in the book which is completely new to an Indian audience, it's probably that end of the book. Yes. I don't think anyone here was particularly aware of the Burma Kids before this. They're the crucial link. The question of how Indian numbers and Indian science passed out of India into the Arab world is not well known, and these guys are responsible. They are a dynasty of Sanskrit literate Buddhist pramukhs, which is what their name originally meant, bosses, headmen, in Balkh in Afghanistan. And they pragmatically convert to Islam when the Arab armies turn up outside their monastery. They haven't got any walls or armies to defend themselves, so they don't really have much choice in the matter. And they embrace the opportunity. One of their kids, who'd previously been studying maths in Srinagar, he'd been sent to the Kashmir Valley to study astronomy and higher mathematics. He is dispatched as a hostage to Rasafa, where he is schooled with the elite of the early Arab world, and makes friends with not only the son of the then caliph, but his future overthrower, Al-Mansur, who's his classmate. And when Al-Mansur wants to raise the flag of rebellion against the Umayyads of Damascus, Khalid ibn Barmak becomes effectively the sort of Indian accountant running his campaign, and does it so well, and his double bookkeeping and his sorting out of the complicated finances of the army is so impressive that he's made vizier of Baghdad. He actually builds Baghdad. He plans Baghdad on a circular Indian model, what sounds very like a mandala in Indian terms. And the first thing he does is send to Ujjain. We have different accounts. One person says he sent a Jewish intermediary to Ujjain, to the observatory. Others say that it was a delegation from Sindh, a different part of India. But either way, the works of Brahmagupta are brought to Baghdad, and a book that the Arabs called the Great Sindh Hind, which seems to have been a compilation of either the complete works of Brahmagupta or the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, but various important mathematical and astrological texts rolled into one, is brought to Baghdad, and there begins the process of translating the Sanskrit classics into Arabic. And it's not just the mathematical and the astronomy, there's also clearly Charaka and early medical texts that are brought too. And the Burma Kids found what sounds very like a sort of Indian Ayurvedic hospital called the Bimaristan in Baghdad. So you have this passage of texts and learning, which Indians seem perfectly ready to pass on. The delegation from Sindh, if that's what it is, arrives in 776, and these books are immediately translated. But it's rather later that they receive their best translation from a kid who comes from what's now Khiva in northern Uzbekistan. That area is called by the Persians Khwarazm, and this kid is known by the people of Baghdad as Al-Khwarizmi, the man from Khwarazm. And he writes a book which demystifies and unwinds all these complex Sanskrit texts, much of which are written in rhyming poetry for ease of memory, into simple, very clear Arabic prose. And that book has the snappy title, the Compendious Book of Hindu Calculation by Calculation and Balancing. And this is just too much of a mouthful, so people just call it by a nickname, Al-Jabr, from which we get our word algebra, and his name, Al-Khwarizmi, becomes our algorithm. And that's how these things pass westwards. Eventually, it's another 400 years before they get to Europe. And the intermediary this time is none other than Fibonacci, who's brought up in Algeria, but part of a Pisan trading colony. When he goes back to Italy, he finds they're still all using Roman numerals, MCV XV1 times XCM VXV. So he thinks they need a bit of help, and he writes the Liber Abaci, which is this book of which unravels Al-Khwarizmi, which is in turn channeling Aryabhata and Brahmagupta. And I'm glad to say that then enters the scene a Scotsman, none other than Michael Scott, who in the folklore of the part of Scotland I grew up in was known as Michael Scott the Wizard. Michael Scott was not a wizard. He was just a great mathematician and a scientist who the Scots didn't understand. And he reads the Liber Abaci, the first edition, and he thinks it's dazzling, but he also thinks it's too theoretical. And he's a good pragmatic Scot, like my people often are. And he says, look, pal, this is all very well, this highfalutin nonsense, but what you need is to be practical. So you need to put in interest rates, money conversion, weights and measures, and so on. Double bookkeeping. So Fibonacci rewrites his Liber Abaci and dedicates the second edition to Michael Scott. And this is the book that teaches the Italians how to do higher maths, and it is the book which then the great Italian artist Piero della Francesca writes 3 treatises about. This is plagiarized by Piero della Francesca's friend Fra Luca de Caroli, who goes to Milan and becomes the flatmate of Leonardo da Vinci. I have to thank the wonderful Nick Booker who told me this. This is not in the book. This is Nick's wonderful discovery since then for this detail. But I love this idea of these Indian ideas turning up, and influencing figures as diverse as that.
I never thought that I would say this as a young Indian studying mathematics. I now thought I'd be actually voluntarily talking about the Fibonacci sequence. But it is so astonishing to me, as I'm sure it is to you, Will, and I'm sure that was one of the motivations that as you say in the introduction, led to you writing this book, is that India plays so little role in understanding of the world's history of ideas. I do think that to an extent, the Islamic Golden Age has begun to become known. Right. People like Al-Khwarizmi have begun to become known, but Aryabhata and Brahmagupta are still
I've been going around on a book tour the last month, and each night I say, everyone's ever heard of these guys, raise your hands. And in Oxford or Cambridge, you might get 4 or 5 people not of Indian heritage, but everywhere else it's 1 or 2. But there's always the Desis there. There's 1 or 2 people brought up in Delhi or Calcutta who with hands go straight up. Aryabhata.
So I know this doesn't have anything to do strictly with the Golden Road, but why do you think it is that India's ideas, and as anybody who is familiar with Asian history would ask this question, why is it that India plays so little role in our understanding of how science evolved, how religion evolved, how everything evolved, as it were?
I think it's a real problem, and I think there's a number of answers to that. The easiest answer is colonialism. The attitudes of Macaulay that a single shelf of good English books is worth more than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. That attitude, we laugh at that now, but that attitude lingers in the curriculum because we have Archimedes and Pythagoras, but we don't have Aryabhata and Brahmagupta. And these guys gave us the numbers we use every day. They gave us 0. This is not some obscure, mathematical theorem. This is the basic stuff that affects everyone in the world every day. It's the nearest thing the human race has to universal language. So that's one thing. I think there's also the way that the Silk Road has sort of become the primary way of understanding East-West contact. It's a very sexy idea of camels padding over the Pamirs and through the Gobi Desert, but it's an idea which basically excludes India, which was the main center of East-West commerce. I think partly it's the way that the different aspects of Indian civilization have been studied in different silos. So all the Buddhist stuff gets put in one room and tied to the story of the Silk Road, while the story of the Sanskritization of Southeast Asia becomes part of the Sanskrit departments, which virtually no one in the West attends. There's even a crisis at Cambridge at the moment about whether the Sanskrit department will continue because so few people are studying it. And then you have I think partly the exaggerations of the Indian nationalists created an enormous pushback. People like R.C. Majumdar claiming that India had subjected the whole of Southeast Asia by the sword and founded what he called Hindu colonies. Certainly my interpretation of this is that while the Cholas did raid Southeast Asia in 1016 and 1025, most of this work of transmission of Indian culture did not come at all by the sword. It came through the work of merchants and the work of missionaries and travelers. And it's all the more remarkable that Indian ideas were passed peacefully, that it was an empire of ideas rather than what's much more common in this world, which is an empire of the sword. So I'm fascinated by the peaceful nature, but I think some of the exaggerations have led people to be suspicious of this. Equally, the kind of Sanjeev Bhaskar style sketch of the Indian uncle claiming Leonardo da Vinci Indian, Jesus Christ Indian, royal family Indian, that kind of caricature has led people to be skeptical of some of the claims of Indian greatness, because often they're framed in sort of unfactual manner. Nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata or helicopters in the Ramayana or whatever it is. And so one of the jobs I try to do in this book is to sort of factually, rationally look at the greatness of Indian civilization without chest-thumping nationalism, without flying a sort of trishul over every page, but to calmly and rationally say how extraordinary the story of Indian civilization, its diffusion over so much of the world is. Over half the world lives today in places where Indian ideas are now or once were dominant. The extraordinary way which Buddhism reached as far as Mongolia and Siberia, the way so many people in Southeast Asia were completely fluent in Sanskrit and left perfect grammatically 100 out of 100 Sanskrit inscriptions all over Southeast Asia. The fact that the premiers, prime ministers of the Cambodian kings could know every detail of their Kalidasa, as well as obscure Tamil saints, and depict all these people in a small temple outside Siem Reap. All this is extraordinary stuff. You don't have to make any of it up. You don't have to add any, unfactual stardust to it. It's an extraordinary story in itself, and this is what I tried to do: to calmly say that this is something extraordinary. And I think a lot of young Indian liberals are slightly scared off ancient India because it's seen to be, in a sense, occupied territory, and I think that's a shame, because I think this is the common property of all Indians, and as an outsider like myself, it's just an extraordinary story to tell. And so to try and do so, I say, without nationalist chest beating, without exaggeration, proving with extensive footnotes, where every idea comes from. There's over 100 and I can't remember 120 pages of footnotes in this book, which it's almost a third of the text. So as people can follow up on this and read themselves further into these topics, whichever interests them. That's what I've aimed to do. Let's see how it goes down. It's so far so good. It seems to be selling well, and the first reviews have been very generous.
I think you've absolutely succeeded well, and just as you did with the Mughals and the East India Company, I think that the Golden Road will open up ancient India once again to a new generation of readers. So, ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple, thank you so much for all your time, Will.
Thank you, Anirudh. I can't wait to read your Chola book, which I think is nearly done, huh?
Yes, almost done. Almost at copy edits. So hopefully we'll get to talk about it again very soon.
I suspect we'll probably be on a panel or two together here and there this year. So I very much look forward to doing this again in person. Likewise.
So thank you all for joining us on this wonderful interview. If you've reached all the way to the end, go pick up The Golden Road right now. What are you guys waiting for? And we'll see you in our next book interview. Thank you so much, all of you. See you soon.